Okay, that looks good. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really happy to be able to, and I hope the online audience can hear me as well. I am Jolan Wuyts. I work as a collections editor at Europeana. I was invited to speak here a bit about, not necessarily about the Weave project. There's a lot of really great presentations coming up that will highlight the outcomes of that project. I want to kind of zoom out a little bit and talk more generally about the kind of complex story and web that is trying to tell stories about minoritized communities and make diverse voices, unheard voices heard on platforms like Europeana and more widely in the cultural heritage sector. I will also close with some kind of call to action to the importance of projects like Weave, which was a really good example of how to embed diversity and inclusion within your project, and how I hope that we can harness projects like these in the future for a more inclusive cultural heritage sphere. So let's start with a bit of a reality check. I strongly feel that diversity it's really hip right now. It's hot, it's happening, diversity is really cool. We have a lot of different things to thank for that in the past few years. Movements like third wave feminism, post-colonial thought and practice, and social movements like Black Lives Matter and Me Too. And I'm very happy to be working at a time in the cultural heritage sector where talking about diversity and inclusion is really front of mind for a lot of people. It's something that is really something that we talk about almost in daily discussion. I do find it important to acknowledge that it is kind of a trend because as quickly as trends come up, they want to die down as well, and the next thing will come up. So acknowledging that this is something that is happening in the past few years really makes it important to me to do all of this work to structurally improve the cultural heritage sphere and embed inclusion into our work now when it's front of mind for a lot of people, when they are discussions that we can have, so that a lot of the structural change that we want to have is in place once this inevitable trend dies down and the next thing pops up. So I have a few examples from the Wellcome Collection and from the Ornament Museum. Some institutions are really far ahead in decolonizing their collections and working on post-colonial thought. Others still need some capacity building, some work to get there. So the question then is, what are the changes that we really want to enact right now? What is really important? And my first point here is the importance of changing hearts and minds within your organization, which seems like a very difficult thing to do. The lucky thing is that this is front of mind for a lot of people now. These discussions are happening. And I do feel like it might be, some people might think that this is a very polarizing discussion to have, that there's people in organizations that are on the left, they're progressive, they're woke, and they have to battle against the traditionalists. I do want to try to kind of say that is a bit of a fallacy. I feel like that battle between progressive and traditionalist is a narrative that is used a lot, mostly because it's very mediatized. It's something that is a really good story to tell. My experience, though, has been in the cultural heritage sector and in Europe specifically, that the discussion with us really hasn't been that polarizing, luckily. That doesn't mean it's not hard. There's still a lot of difficult discussions to have. And an example I wanted to give from that is this slide comes from the Europeana Essentials slide deck, which is a slide deck with a lot of slides that our colleagues can take out and use within their own presentations when they go to a conference, when they speak at an event, when they want to represent Europeana in some way. This is a slide that was added fairly recently, and so it says, I need to turn around for this, diversity and inclusion. We want to create a brave space in which everyone feels welcome, represented, and safe. We want to identify areas of concern and understand our unconscious biases, where, in our people, in our training, in our editorial output, in European content, in our technical accessibility. Reading this, you might think, yeah, duh, of course, we want to make people feel welcome and safe. That's a super normal thing to do. But reading those sentences, I am mostly reminded of all of the discussions that we had around this terminology, about what it actually meant, which were really important to have. Looking at these words, I remember discussions we had about what is a brave space or a safe space anyway? Are people really not feeling welcome to come to a Europeana event, for instance? I feel welcome going to a conference. Are other people really not having that? Aren't we already diverse enough in Europeana, in the cultural heritage sector? And these are all very valid questions, very important questions, because those questions then lead to the discussions that we have to do this changing of hearts and minds, to recognize that there are unconscious biases that we have, that there is action that we need to undertake to make people feel more inclusive. Am I forgetting anything? No. So an example of this need for changing hearts and minds is our own editorial team. I'm the guy in the bottom right with a bit younger, a lot shorter hair. So our editorial team is a team of 7, and one of the questions we asked ourselves is, aren't we already diverse enough in this team? And in some ways, yes, we have a really good gender balance in our team. We have more than 5 different countries in Europe that are represented. We speak more than 5 different languages. We're all from very diverse, different backgrounds and lived experiences. So there are a lot of stories that we can tell within our team. But that doesn't mean, of course, that we in some way can or try to represent the whole cultural breadth of Europe's history or Europe's legacy. We can't do that. We wouldn't even want to try to do that. That's an impossible undertaking. And there are a lot of stories that we can tell, but we do see that when we go through our database, when we go through our content, we find so many objects, so many stories that are really important and really nice to tell, but that we in our team just don't have the expertise or the background for to highlight. A kind of foundational motto or adage that I find very important here is nothing about us without us, which is also maybe a very straightforward and normal thing to say, but I do find it important to acknowledge it, because not everywhere or all the time is this acknowledged yet. For instance, we celebrate Women's History Month every year in March. We have a month chock full of editorial about feminism, about important women throughout Europe's history, about the role and the power of women in history. And I'm sure that if our team would be all men, for instance, we would get a lot of backlash, a lot of criticism about why is this team of men writing about women's history without a single woman actually helping to write this, without a single woman on the team. That makes a lot of sense. This seems super normal, but that same idea isn't often or isn't always extended to other communities or other stories yet. It's, for instance, still not commonplace to find it normal that if you write about disability, for instance, that someone who is from that community or has lived experience with being differently abled has at least proofread this blog or has had some input into this blog, or has been part of the editorial process at all. Now, that doesn't mean that we won't be able to write about anything anymore. That's another question that sometimes comes up, like, can I, and to take me as an example, won't I be able to write about women's history anymore? Of course not. It doesn't mean nothing about us without only us. It just means that we really need to center the people and the communities that we're writing about in the editorial that we're doing. In our Women's History Month, it's our women colleagues who lead the editorial process of Women's History Month. In Pride Month, it's our queer colleagues who lead that work and that effort. So, an example of the learning process that we had within Europeana is a blog I wrote about sign languages 2 years ago. The International Day of Sign Language was coming up, and we wanted to write a blog about this really interesting, rich history of sign languages in Europe. It might surprise you to know that I'm not deaf. I'm not, part of the deaf community. I'm not hard of hearing. I don't know anyone who is part of that community. But we did want to write this blog, so I started reaching out to some organizations from that community that didn't get back to me in time before the International Day of Sign Languages. So we decided, okay, I'll just write the blog. I did a lot of research, I read a lot, I learned a lot, and I published the blog. I was so stressed about something in this blog being offensive or sparking outrage or just historically misrepresenting this community that I put a disclaimer on the blog saying this was not written by someone from the deaf community. If you see something in this blog that you want to change, please get in contact with us. Shortly after I published the blog, a friend of a friend that I knew that was of that community read the blog and we got positive feedback, so everything went well in the end. But retrospectively, we felt that there really has to be a better way to kind of write this editorial. I didn't feel comfortable trying to write about disability again with all of the stress and the uncertainty around it, but we also didn't want to not write about this history because it's really important to highlight. So we had to find a better way to do this. I'm very happy to say that this year is the first year that we have an editorial grants program where people can send in their blogs, their blog ideas, and if this is a piece of editorial about a minoritized community or topic and the people that are writing it are from that community, then we have money that we can give them to fairly remunerate them for that work and compensate them for collaborating with us to write that blog. One of the outcomes of that for this year was a blog about the bas-relief, written by a museum educator who has years of experience in using bas-reliefs to enhance the experience of people that are visually impaired or blind to experience paintings and other works in a bas-relief version. So this is the famous painting by Hokusai, printed in a bas-relief version so that people can actually feel the painting. This blog we would have never been able to write within our team in the kind of respectful, interesting manner that Silene Carboni, who wrote this blog, did. So this clearly was a better way to write a blog about disability than the one that I wrote 2 years ago. Another thing I want to highlight is the importance of having content to write editorial about. Of course, if there is no diverse content in your collection, it's really hard to try and bring in someone to write about something that isn't there or that isn't captured. This at the same time is one of the hardest kind of nuts to crack because it goes back to the foundational collections of the cultural heritage institutions themselves that need to work on decolonizing their collections, editing their metadata, contextualizing their database. Because there might already be content to work with, but this content might contain language that causes offense, that has outdated terminology. As an example of that, at Black History Month last year, we published a blog called Black People in European Art. We have a lot of really beautiful, important artworks that depict people of color, but a lot of those artworks have metadata, titles, descriptions that use language or depict scenes that are outdated, offensive, that we don't want to have people get in contact with. We still think it's important to create those galleries and highlight these stories, but we wanted to do so in a way that didn't cause harm in any way. So what we did for this gallery is we hired a sensitivity reader to go through these items and assess them, and we put a content warning at the top of the blog, or of the gallery, to provide context saying that some of the metadata here is outdated. We couldn't change the titles and the descriptions of these items, not only because it's not technically feasible in Europeana, but because this content and this metadata is owned by the institutions themselves, and the responsibility goes back to them to kind of work on this metadata. That said, as Europeana, as a platform that shows this content, we do have a responsibility as a steward of this content to support cultural heritage institutions in this work. We try to do that by doing capacity building, to give institutions the tools they need, the resources, the knowledge to work on decolonizing their collections, to come to a post-colonial collection. And one of the examples that I'm really happy to see is that both in the Europeana Aggregators Forum as in the Europeana Network Association, there is now a task force and a working group on how to work to decolonize your collections and deal with this content. Both of them have recently come out with a report which has recommendations for these institutions on how to collaboratively work on this issue. So, my last point. Projects are really important to this. Projects, by definition, want to change something about the business as usual, about the status quo. European projects, on top of that, have a consortium of, or have the opportunity to create a consortium of organizations and people that have come from different backgrounds, different countries, different lived experiences to work towards a shared goal, which is exactly the kind of sphere that allows for meaningful diversity and inclusion work. This means that projects can work directly with organizations and people that have already done the groundwork in building trust with communities, topics that are minoritized or unheard, to make those voices heard. So in the Weave project, for instance, partners like ERIAC, CRDI, Pedejumbo were completely crucial in making this connection happen, because if organizations like that wouldn't be in a project, the length of a project just doesn't make it possible to do this groundwork of trust building and collaboration if you're not an organization that has already made that one of your key goals. What I also really liked about the Weave project is that it not only worked with minoritized ethnic communities, but it also looked at minoritized topics, traditions. The Castellers blog and the movie Yesterday was a really good example of that. And the stories about dance, for instance, that we saw were very good examples. So another project that is starting in a few weeks or a few months is called De-Bias, and is another generic service project that, as one of their key kind of outcomes, is the creation of ways to identify the metadata language in our cultural heritage collections that we want to recontextualize, that we might want to change, or even want to remove, both in an automatic way, but also in working closely with these communities to come to a collaborative way of working. So this is a kind of call to action to all of you to please keep on writing and proposing projects like this that put diversity and inclusion at the center. We really need to do this now before the trend dies down. At Europeana, we will continue to hold space for projects like these. We will continue to keep resources free to collaborate in these kind of goals. We are going to continue to build capacity with organizations to do this much needed work. And we are also going to keep inviting minoritized voices to make unheard voices heard on our platform. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jolan, for the very interesting presentation and the approach that Europeana takes on let's say, bringing these unheard voices online and making them available. Any questions from the floor? No questions?
I'm aware that I've used up almost all my time, so questions later can also be made.
Yes.
Go ahead.
A small question, please.
Small question. I was wondering, Jolan, you were talking about, for instance, Black History Month. You made an editorial because you wanted to speak out for this unheard community, but you still find that in some collections there are problematic records or problematic metadata. So in how far is it possible for an organization like Europeana to intentionally reach out to some providers to flag such findings and perhaps to, more on a bilateral basis, try to work towards better practices?
Yeah, for the people online, the question was how can organizations like Europeana maybe more proactively during things like Black History Month reach out to providers to flag content that contains metadata that they might want to change or that is offensive? A really good question. On the one hand, this is a slow process that if you want to create editorial and you see something that is offensive, you can of course go back to the provider, but this will take weeks, months to actually update into the collection. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. It's really important to, this feedback mechanism is really important to set up. I feel like it hasn't been structurally made that well yet in Europeana. We have a feedback button that you can, as a user, also give feedback on items you see, but we don't have a very open line of a communication with all these providers yet. There's no direct way of saying someone flagged this item, you might want to look at that, and at the next ingestion point you can then update it. This is possible, but this needs a lot of intermediaries and emails, so this is a slow process. And I really hope that we work towards a way that keeps these lines of communication a bit more open. Because we also see on the provider side that the questions are there, like have people ask,
I wanted to say, is this working? I wanted to say that exactly, Jolan. I think that if I were a content provider and I had, like, let's say 200,000 items in Europeana, possibly there are 3, 4, or 5 that actually are totally outdated in terms of terminology and language. I would want to be notified that, look, in the next cleaning round you do or the next update you do, look at those items. So
yes, 100%. I mean, it's something that as a provider you could also see Europeana gives value to that content of being ingested. You can have that direct input into your collection that you otherwise wouldn't have if it was just on your own website or in your archives. So I hope that we can make that a bit more structural soon. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, I raised my hand just because I wanted to add that indeed between Europeana and the content provider, as you say, there are intermediates. And the Photo Consortium, for example, as an accredited aggregator for Europeana, is really the intermediate between the Europeana and the individual content provider. So indeed, it happened. It happened in my work experience that people from Europeana notified me and say, hey, we got this feedback from this user. Can you please interact with the content provider? And we did. And it was super important, as you say, because perhaps the content provider, who has a larger archive, for example, may not be fully aware of this type of issues. Also because, and we will talk about this later with John, also because perhaps these metadata were created many years ago, and yes, there was a different sensitivity towards some language, some terminology. So indeed, I think this is really a teamwork, and as you say, the process is still a bit slow, it takes time, but I think we are on the right way, so yeah. And projects like this one, the Weave, I think really made a difference in this sense, especially on the side of awareness of the issue, and it is in the strand of the work that Europeana is leading in diversity and inclusion in digital cultural heritage collections.
Thank you, Valentina. I totally agree.